Welcome back. In this video, I'm going to introduce you to the psychology of sensation and perception, which is chapter 5 of the Openstax psychology textbook. Sensation and perception is how we make sense of the world around us, and it is essential to understand how we make sense of the world in order to understand how science works, or at least experimental science works. So since like the 1920s and most of the 19th century before that, scientific inquiry was based on observations. So when we define our variables are generally defined operationally, which means they depend on our ability to see, smell, taste, hear, or feel something that's changed in the environment. So in order to understand like the law of gravity, there has to be an awareness of something that's happening that we can measure, and those measurements are based on what we can actually see happening. So if there's something going on at the level of our perceptual awareness that transforms what's actually happening in the world, we need to know that in order to understand how science works. So this chapter on sensation and perception should be entry-level reading for anyone who wishes to become a scientist. I've got this window very small, so I'm not sure how much of this you'll be able to see and how much of it I will be able to see since I'm looking at it at about the same size. Um, but in this picture, what I think the authors or the editors are trying to show you is we are always being bombarded by lots of sensory information. In my office right now, I'm just staring at a brick wall, but there are so many different bricks, each with different paint textures. There's this closet next to me that's painted the same blue as the wall behind me. Um, so I can see quite a bit of sensory or visual information, but I can also hear traffic in the highway about a quarter mile from my house. I can see light out my slider over here. If I focused on it, I could like smell what my office smells like, and I feel the seat that's under me. There are thousands of like bits of information that are bombarding our sensory system all the time, but we usually only focus on a couple of those at any one moment. So there are 5 sense systems, and the 2 words sensation and perception are going to be used in their 2 different processes. Sensation refers to the world that impacts us or our ability to make contact with the world. So our eyes see, our ears hear, our nose smells, our tongue tastes, and our skin touches. And there's some other um, combinations of those when we get into like the awareness of things inside our body, for example, our feeling for our body in space. Um, but those are the main sensory systems, and there are networks of nerve cells and organs for those senses that allow us to transduce outside information, outside stuff into sense awareness of those things. So for each of those systems, such as vision, we have an awareness of different colors, for example, and we can differentiate between different shades of colors. So like even in the blue wall behind me, you can see like where the light's hitting it, it's a little bit lighter blue than in the corner, like right here, which is a little bit darker. Um, there is a point at which there can be a change in the intensity of a color that we don't even recognize it. It looks like the same color, but actually there's a gradual difference. The point at which we can finally see the difference is called the point of just noticeable difference, or this absolute threshold. Um, the same thing is true for sound. Like we don't hear anything and all of a sudden, oh, we hear it. Or maybe there's a buzz in the background and there's a certain amount of change that has to happen for us to recognize that change in sound. Uh, I'm realizing that I'm taking too long, so I'm going to try to speed this up a little bit. So we've talked about sensation there. Now moving on to perception. Perception is how we make sense of the information that comes in. So it comes in as just raw sensation. We just see a bunch of light particles. Like right now, all you're seeing is a bunch of photons that are, when you see my face, these are just photons that hit your retina through your eye, or in the back of your eye. Um, but you see like a person and you're hearing actual words and phrases and sentences with meaning, based on like a background of understanding. All of that meaning making is perception. The sense organs can only receive in vision photons. And the photons interact with certain nerves in the retina, rods and cones, and that information is sent to your visual processing center. And somewhere in all of that process, we don't know exactly where it's happening, but somewhere in that nervous system activity, we we perceive uh, human faces, and we recognize human faces, and we recognize words and phrases, and so on. So there's two forms that that can take. One is bottom up processing, and that's when you would look at my face and say, okay, there's two eyes, there's a nose, there's a mouth, there's like a bun on the head. Oh, it's a person, it's a human person. I'm looking at a person, got it. So you take the little pieces and then put them together to form. So that's bottom up processing. Top down processing is you look at me and immediately see a person, and you're like, yeah, he's a person because he's got eyes and nose and mouth and everything about my face and my appearance you understand based on your pre knowledge that you're looking at a person. And I just described that. So there's a little visual demonstration of what I said, or illustration. Okay, just because there are sense data in your environment doesn't mean you'll be aware of it. So there are a couple of things that can change your awareness. One is sensory adaptation. So that's listed up here. Sensory adaptation occurs all the time because we're being inundated with all this sense information. If we get the same kind of information long enough, we just stop noticing it. So like if you go into a restaurant, it smells funny. You're like, oh, it smells funny. I don't think I can eat in here. After a while of just being there, like 20 minutes, you forget the smell. Like you don't even notice it anymore. If it changed, you would notice it, but at that point, you don't notice it anymore. Or maybe like you're in a hospital room and you hear like a beeping or a buzzing or a humming. And you feel like you can't even have a conversation because this annoying buzzing that's going on. Wait for 15 or 20 minutes and you will adapt to it and it'll disappear. Like you won't even notice it anymore. It'll just fade away. Um, and that happens quite a bit. Now, there's also the influence of your attention. So if you're focused on something and like really dialed in, you're gonna ignore most of everything else in your environment. So like if you're watching a movie and you're engrossed in the movie, you might not notice like a change in temperature. You might not notice, or until it gets really hot or really cold. You might not notice someone even like walking by behind you if there's a lot of activity going on. So attention can really affect what it is you notice in your environment. Motivation, I guess, can influence your perception. Really, anything can influence your perception. Belief systems, values, these are listed here too. What you've been taught growing up. So if you've been taught, oh, like for example, I learned growing up that UFOs have never been seen, or there's a disbelief in extraterrestrial life forms. And so I remember one time I was sitting along a river bank with a friend of mine. This was maybe when I was 22. And he pointed out like this light that was moving around, maybe 30 yards above the water. And he goes, "What do you think that is?" And I said, "I don't know, a firefly." He goes, "It's too big to be a firefly." And like we went through this whole conversation, and he saw a UFO and I saw a firefly because he believed that UFOs were possible and I didn't. And so our pre-understanding shaped what it was we actually saw. And that's always going on. I'm realizing that my watch might be bothering you with the reflection. Sorry about that. Let me switch hands. Let's see. So how can motivation shape your perception? They give the example of feeling your phone ring. So maybe it's in your pocket and you think you feel it buzz and you pull it out and look at it. Um, the only way to really understand that is the anticipation being rooted in what's important to you and what you hope will have, what you hope will happen. Therefore, I guess that background makes the likelihood of perceiving something higher, even if it's not there. So like a false positive perception or sensation. Now, I love these perceptual illusions. It's when we think we know what it is we're looking at, when in fact, objectively, we're wrong. So, one of those examples is the Muller liar illusion. And so that's when these two lines, so this one looks visibly longer than this line. And so it looks like this one is almost, you know, 30% longer. But if you were to get rid of these ends, so these ends fold in, these fold out, if you get rid of those ends, you notice that the lines are identical in size, even though they don't look identical in size. But with a ruler, you'll recognize that they're identical in size. Same with this line here, that's the edge of the window, and this line here, which is the edge of the ceiling and floor, so the whole length of the wall. These are the same exact length, and you could put a straight line, a parallel line between that one and then between this one, even though it looks like this is so much longer. It's a perceptual illusion. We feel like the, or we know that the window isn't quite as tall as the wall, but the way that it's structured, the wall is further away, so our perception of things that are further away gets smaller. That's monocular visual cues. I think that there's going to be a slide about that coming up. So a lot of what we perceive, seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, is a phenomenon of, or is an illusion. We think we're recognizing something when in fact it's not there. And a lot of our awareness is based on these illusions, I think. So, how do we, or what is the physics of sensation? We don't recognize sound waves or um, light waves, but in fact, this is how sense data interacts with us or how it reaches us. And there are certain properties that we can measure about the physics of the sense data. That includes amplitude and wavelength of audio and visual waves. And so amplitude is how high between the crest and the trough, or so that difference. And so I guess how tall a wave is, and then the length is how it is from peak to peak or trough to trough. And again, this will help us understand what color a light is or what pitch a sound is. And then frequency is how quickly the wavelengths occur. There are light waves that we can't see. In fact, there's a very tiny margin in all light waves that we are visually aware of. So that there are light waves that are occurring, like when we're outside in the sun. We don't see a lot of sun rays. We can see the sun, so they're part of the light waves that we can register, we can process. But there's a lot more going on than we are visual than we have visual access to. So you can see these are the frequency levels, and here's the color that we can see, and then here's all the others above and below what we're capable of recognizing. And this is another way of looking at that using wavelength, amplitude, and color. The same thing can be said for sound waves. There's a very narrow range of sound wave activity that we can hear. Above it, we can't hear it. For example, dogs can hear sounds that are higher frequencies than we can hear, and younger people can hear higher frequencies than older people can hear. And the same is true on the lower end. So there are some examples of the frequencies of common sounds. And so we've got like a jet there at the top. We've got a car driving there at the bottom. And I can't really see the other ones. All right, vision is the perception that humans focus the most on, or at least humans in the West focus the most on. So we tend to describe our world visually. When we're reading a novel or watching a movie, the emphasis of description is usually on vision, but we could just as easily describe everything in terms of smell. Dogs, for example, have a much stronger sense of smell and rely more on their sense of smell than hearing and vision. Humans rely first on vision, then hearing, then possibly smell or touch. Um, but definitely vision is the top. So a lot of perception psychologists focus on vision. So in order to understand the visual system and really any sense system, there's an organ that is responsible for transforming information in the environment into information in our brain. And so the eyeball is the structure for vision. And so we've got all we can see. So if you're looking at my eye, you can see the basic shape of it. You can see the iris, which is a muscle. That's the blue part of my eye. And that can constrict and expand in order to allow more light in through the pupil, which is the black. It's actually a hole or an opening that captures light. So light can pass in through the pupil, and there's like protective covering over the eyeball as well. But the light gets magnified and focused by a lens, which is right behind the pupil. So light goes in through the pupil as controlled by the iris, hits the lens, and then is reflected onto the back of the eyeball, which is where all the little um, neurons or photoreceptors are. So the photoreceptors can see different light or different color combinations, and so black and white, I think red and green, um, blue and yellow, possibly. I think there's a list of what those different, these would be cones, are sensitive to. But that's where vision is actually happening. So that they're just light waves until they hit those photoreceptors. Then they're transferred into electrical impulses, which get sent down the optic nerve to, are we going to show a picture? Man, there are a lot of pictures of the eyeball here. So let me move on to one of these other ones. You can see a little bit better here. This is the lens, the pupils here, the iris is around it there, the lens. And then back here is the retina. Look at all those nerves. So the very center of the retina is called the fovea, and that's where we have our most sensitive vision. It's where we can see color, and then we can kind of see black and white around here. So that's why at night, when there is no color, everything is black and white, we actually have trouble seeing what's right in the center of our visual field. We have to kind of look just away from things. And the optic nerve is where the information passes out, or leaves the eyeball and goes to the brain for visual processing. So I mentioned earlier there are rods and cones. The rods see black and white. They're useful for nighttime vision, and cones are the highest acuity information, and that's where we see colors. I'm not sure what that's showing you. All right, when the optic nerve leaves the eyeball, they actually the two optic nerves cross over and then send information to the opposite hemisphere. It's kind of strange. So what you see with your right eye goes to your left hemisphere. What you see with your left eye goes to your right hemisphere. Um, Usually, if you don't have a divided corpus callosum, which is right in the middle of your brain, it allows hemispheres to communicate with each other. If that's not impaired, you don't notice this change. I'm not going to bother with that. There you go. So these are the combined cells. So in the cones, there's black and white rod, yellow, blue. Oh, okay, I was right. So blue and yellow, red and green. Nice. So this theory of vision, I'm not going to go into. You can read about the opponent process theory and do this visual demonstration. But it's based on, it's an assumption based on one, uh, the way that cones can see a pair of colors, and then two, this phenomenon that happens when we look at a color image for a long period of time. So moving on from color vision, we're going to talk about how we can recognize how our orientation in space, or the way we orient ourselves in space. So being able to look out the window and sort of observe how far away something is based on what it looks like. These are called depth cues. And so our eyes are really good at depth perception because they're giving us 2 points of information. So it's like a um, biangulation of an object, so we can kind of see around both sides of the object, and that by combining our left and right eyes, what they see together, we can get a sense of how far away something is or how big it is. But if we only had one eye, we couldn't do that. So there are some monocular cues that allow us to recognize or identify how far away something is or where it's situated in space. I'll let you read about those. I'll let you read about color blindness. Um, I went into detail about the eyeball, but the same thing is occurring with the skin and the corpuscles underneath the skin for touch. There's, as you can see here, there's some sophisticated mechanics inside the ear. So it's not just your earlobe isn't just catching sound waves and then you hear things. There's a very fine and detailed process going on right up here. Where sound waves are transduced into vibrations that get sent in to the auditory processing center. Also, I'll let you read about that. And there are quite a few questions about hearing problems, vision problems, so make sure you take a look at that on in order to prepare for exams. Ditto on taste. So the tongue has taste receptors, and as far as like all of our senses are concerned, the tongue has the fewest or has the smallest variation of the types of information it can receive. So as far as we know now, there's just 5, possibly 6 different stimuli that the tongue can detect, whereas the nose, it's like over 300 different smells, and the eye can see, I think, over 160 brightnesses, maybe 260, I forget exactly, but that's been known for over a century. But taste just has about 5, and then some. This says some research suggests that there's a 6th. I'll let you read about how that transductive process occurs. Again, with touch, I mentioned, so there's different types of corpuscles for pre pressure, for temperature, and for pain. And then inside the inner ear, remember I mentioned the awareness of your body in space. So there's this vestibular sense, and when that's disrupted, you get dizzy or lightheaded, or you feel like the world is spinning around you, and that just has to do with fluid in your inner ear. This is your awareness of your body's position. So like you can feel if you were to wake up, you could like feel that you're like leaning to the side or like your legs are above your head, even if the whole room is oriented the same way. So maybe if you're on a ship, you can kind of feel that maybe the ship is pitching to the left or to the right. That's this awareness. Well, that would probably be vestibular sense, but proprioception is your awareness of like your bodily movement. Excuse me, your body's position. So maybe like your arm is above your head. Um, do this sometime. Like if you're taking a nap and you have your legs crossed, you might forget which leg is crossed over the other unless you look at it. And so you might try to slowly feel it out and try to get a sense of it and then check to see if you're right. Um, it's an interesting experiment to do. Kinesthetics is the perception of your movement, bodily movement. So there's a lot of studies of like dance and sport and the fluidly moving body. Um, I mentioned earlier with top-down processing, when you look at me, you kind of immediately see a person, and then like based on that knowledge, you can interpret like this white blob as like a shirt that I'm wearing, and this here on my wrist, a watch that I'm wearing. And so all of that information comes on the background of your knowledge that you're looking at a person. And so that top-down processing is studied by Gestalt psychology or Gestalt perception theory, which is the understanding that our perception comes in whole units or gestalts. And there are certain principles to how we recognize whole units. So, like behind me here, you can see like this window. Even though up there there's like a corner that's kind of cut off, you still kind of imagine that the corner is there, even though it's not part of your visual field right now. And you can see part of a bench or a stool behind me. Even though you can't see the whole stool, you imagine that the rest of it's there. So you're completing the whole object, even though you don't have, actually, you can see it over here in the mirror. So you're able to perceive an object, even though there are parts of it that are missing. So there are a whole bunch of Gestalt principles of perception: the figure ground relationship, proximity, similarity, continuity, closure. I'll let you read about those. Um, I've given a few examples of this already. It's kind of a perceptual illusion. It's also the way that we perceive objects based on their context or their environmental surround. And so this is the vases faces illusion. So the center object here is a vase, and so you can like put flowers in it, you pour water in it, and it holds it. It stands with the base down here, and then behind it is just empty space. Or you can see this as like a nose and a nose and an eye and an eye, and then these lips way down here. So it's like a face looking at a face, and then the faces are shadowed, and there's just light in the background. So when we see the faces, the vase disappears. When we see the vase, the faces disappear. We can only see one at a time. And so it's always one object on a background of context. But the context and figure can switch. It's called figure ground illusion or figure ground relationship. Um, this goes into detail about those Gestalt principles of perception, and they're a fascinating read. They come from a paper written by Max Wertheimer, who I studied in graduate school and wrote a master's thesis on. Um, but it's how you recognize pretty much everything in your visual, auditory, and probably olfactory field. Um, we make sense of our world using these principles. So if you're interested in understanding it better, take a close look at those. This is the duck rabbit illusion, kind of like the faces vases illusion. You can either see a duck or a rabbit. If you see the duck, then take a minute and try to find the rabbit. If you see the rabbit, take a minute and try to see the duck. There's recent research, and I say recent, the last 25 years, 20, or I guess 30 years now, about implicit biases in perception. And there's good evidence that things like racial discrimination occurs unconsciously as a product of perception. And so those perceptions have been shaped. Remember, values, motivation, and culture influence perception. That was one of the first slides. Um, there's been a lot of research showing that perception of people of color comes with additional details that the perceptual object or the stimulus doesn't actually give you. So in this example, um, it said um, the age of black children was overestimated, and black children were judged as significantly less innocent than white children of the same age. So there was this uh, bias that was occurring. So someone might think, oh, I don't discriminate against people of color, when their basic perceptions that they feel like they're just looking at what's out there is already shading their perception in a racially biased way. So a lot of interesting research done in law enforcement about that specific problem. In 2016, I believe there was a pretty big study about perceiving um, people of color as more threatening and stronger, even when all other factors have been controlled. If you're interested, I guess, yeah, I'll invite you to ask for that article that I have, and I've actually written a chapter about that. Um, Pretty interesting. Oh, and I've reached the end. Thank goodness. I thought this would never end.